Okay, foundation of modern Israel. Get into a little bit more of what's going on in terms of understanding what happened uh, to the Jewish nation of ancient times. Now, one of the things that Jews ended up forming communities all over the world. Rome and Alexandria were relatively famous early on, and many other major population centers would also get their own either Jewish quarter or at least a area that was heavily populated by Jews who had fled the Middle Eastern region. Uh, these Jewish outposts are recorded as early as 139 BC. Thing that was driving this was what a state of pretty much constant warfare going on at the time. Israel was essentially kind of in a crossroads. It was in a kind of a strategic position, and there was a lot of political instability at the time. Due to their location and the fact that they had outposts, and when I say outpost, it really they're more, think of it more as like an immigrant quarter than an actual like their own little settlements. These immigrant quarters created uh, ties back to the motherland, which allowed the Jewish people to become uh, natural traders, where they would trade back and forth amongst themselves, bringing goods and services all around the Mediterranean and becoming rather famous as merchants. Combination of dual civil wars occurring in the Roman Empire brought Pompey to Judea. Uh, in the process, this ended up bringing a lot of Jewish slaves to Rome, and then later on, Caesar would give Judea religious freedom due to their support. So the Romans had kind of a mix of tolerance and intolerance, but it was kind of like a binary decision. It was completely yes or completely no. So for the Jews of Caesar's time, they did have religious freedom under the Roman Empire. So 66 AD, major Jewish uprising occurs in the Israeli kingdoms, and this will end up uh, leading to a Roman invasion and the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Uh, this process ended up with a large amount of the Jews being enslaved, uh, others scattering, and the remainder that were left behind uh, were economically destitute. So, where do we get the word Palestine? Well, uh, the Romans named it Philistia after the Philistines. And what we end up calling it is Palestine or Roman Palestine. The term Palestine is very similar to the way we called Deutschland Germany. It was the Latinized version of a word, and the English world picks up the Latinized variants of a country's names rather than their generally chosen ones. Roman Palestine was then therefore paganized because the majority of the population moving in were, well, obviously there wasn't a whole lot of monotheism going on at that time other than for the Jews. So, and of course the beginning Christian sects that were coming out of Judaism at that time. So uh, essentially paganism was brought back to Israel. Uh, so around 326 AD, we start seeing, as Christianity is gaining strength in the Roman Empire, Christian pilgrimages to the Jerusalem area start beginning. Uh, with the pilgrimages comes a very rapid Christianization of the area. Uh, so there are still Jews left behind, but their numbers are fairly small. Uh, and essentially, we have a changeover from paganism to Christianity. So, we end up doing a little bit of an overview on Islam and how it impacts the area. Islam is an Abrahamic religion, which means it's a brother of Christianity and Judaism. They all believe that their philosophical thoughts, and if not even their bloodlines, run back to Abraham. Islam recognizes the full validity of the Old Testament. So to them, the Old Testament uh, more or less is fully valid. However, the Quran makes some additions to the Old Testament where they clarify things. Uh, Generally, Islam recognizes Jews, Christians, and Muslims to be children of the book, meaning that they all have a certain level of equality to an extent. Obviously, each religion considers themselves as superior to the other, but like for instance, Islam would look on Christians and Jews as being a superior belief to uh, other non-Abrahamic religions. Islam recognizes Jesus as a special prophet who ascended at the end of his life and will return at the time of judgment. Uh, they believe that the books of the New Testament are corrupted. Essentially, that they were uh, the word that the prophet Jesus brought was a true word, but the process of copying it down was corrupted and is not fully valid. They believe that their prophet Muhammad was given special visions from the angel Gabriel. The Quran is recognized by all Muslims as the Word of God. Now, interesting about Jerusalem in terms of Islam is in the beginning of Islam, uh, when Muslims did their prayers, they would face towards Jerusalem. Uh, but early on, they had some disputes. They're essentially Jewish people who were living in the Arabia Peninsula recognized the kinship and attempted to essentially uh, infiltrate their doctrine into Islam. And this basically caused conflict, and essentially the uh, Islam would end up facing Mecca rather than Jerusalem to this day. Uh, Jerusalem features as the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. One thing also to understand about Islam is the hadiths. Hadiths are the closest equivalent would be apocrypha, whereas the Quran is purported to be the writings of Muhammad via uh, angelic inspiration. The hadiths are definitely written after the fact by followers of Muhammad, and these hadiths essentially are not all universally accepted. So sometimes you'll see some of the more outrageous things people claim are the Quran are actually hadiths, and not all hadiths are recognized universally. Some are considered essentially. Uh, Islam tends to break down by what hadiths they find to be valid. Uh, so Islam has two major factions, Sunni and Shiite, and there are some 71 known sects altogether. Maybe more, but 71 is the number I have for my best source at this point. So uh, you have a very diverse group of people in Islam, many languages, many ethnicities. Uh, Essentially, we tend to think of uh, the Arabs of Saudi Arabia as being like the typical Muslim, but in fact, they're kind of a minority. The majority of people who follow Islam do not live in the Middle East. There are far more in Indonesia and Nigeria than there are in Saudi Arabia. The languages are very different. For instance, Turkish, although it has picked up many Arabian words due to the religious contact, are very distinct languages. Knowing one doesn't help you with the other. And the ethnicities, obviously, over time, different ethnicities have had domination over essentially the Middle East. Uh, we've had Arabs uh, and different ethnic subgroups of Turks through the ages, and these groups don't always necessarily get along with each other.